the high desert of Boulder, Colorado, the Mutant Nexus, about a mile above the sea level portion of the Babylon Matrix, where we are nestled just beneath the beautiful Flatiron Mountains, this is Jonathan Zapp of ZappOracle.com. Welcome to Crossing the Event Horizon. This is a talk on the Singularity archetype based on my book, Crossing the Event Horizon, Human Metamorphosis and the Singularity Archetype. We are being recorded by Bernadette Salem, who's doing our videography here. She's working her PhD in film at the University of Lancaster in England, but luckily is in the States at the moment to assist. And today is February 25th of 2018. And we're starting out here in the visual novelty of my study where I work pre-dawn every morning on my writings. But soon we're going to descend to the basement of my house here in Boulder, where I've got a big video screen and where we can better display the 95 slides of the PowerPoint that goes with this talk. Okay, we are back. We're now in our basement facility here, and once again, my niece Bernadette Salem is doing the video, and we have some technical assistance from Andrew Anderson. So, Crossing the Event Horizon relates to some of the most important themes in human life, but we'll get into that in a moment. But I'll just start with a little introduction of how I got into this strange subject when I was 20 years old. And basically, what I've always followed through my life is what I call the path of the numinous. And this is also an essay and another YouTube on my site. It's called The Path of the Numinous, Living and Working with the Creative Muse. So numinous means spirit. So numinous is just something that sort of lights up as having an uncanny significance. And often that will turn out to be something that is energized by an archetype, and we'll get into archetypes momentarily. So basically, it's about following a numinous object of perception down the rabbit hole. And this is how I got into this strange subject, which relates to both the future evolution of the species and also the personal event horizon of death. So one thing that was very numinous for me when I was growing up, besides some personal paranormal experiences that were related, were certain science fiction visions. One of the most powerful was a black and white British 1960 science fiction film called Village of the Damned. And I watched that with my dad. I might have been like 12 or 13 years old. And the film, I had seen many good sci-fi films, but this film had an effect on me that was almost like a religious vision. Like I felt it was connected to my deepest destiny, and it just stirred something deep inside, and I knew there was something really significant about it. And another experience I had when I was probably 13 or 14 years old at the Bronx High School of Science was reading Arthur C. Clarke's classic science fiction novel, Childhood's End. And I was shocked when I was reading it because it seemed like I was finding things from my own sci-fi fantasies that I thought I would write about in this book that was published 4 years before I was born. How was such a thing possible? So, in 1978, when I was 20 years old in my last year of college, and I decided I was going to write a philosophy honors paper about this subject, but had no idea how I was going to figure out what the patterns were or what it meant. My mom, Bernadette's grandmother, Bernice Zapp, who's a psychologist for 44 years, gave me a very important lead. She said, well, you should look into this guy, Carl Jung, and his theory of the archetypes and the collective unconscious. So I go to the college library, and there are these impressive black Princeton Bollingen collected, edition of the works of Carl Jung. But I'm kind of a little bit skeptical about whether this is going to be relevant. I mean, this guy reached manhood in the 19th century. He's the son of a Protestant minister. What is going to be in these heavy volumes is going to relate to the weird sci-fi obsessions of this strange Jewish kid from the Bronx. But I see there's an index volume, I pull that down, And I see, oh wow, near the end of his life, he wrote a book called Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the sky. Well, that's a direct hit because both Childhood's End and Village of the Damned begin with flying saucers. So I pull out that book and I start flipping through it, and I see that Jung was writing about this near the end of his life, and he couldn't quite let go of the subject, because at the end of the book there's an afterword, and then after the afterword there's an epilogue, and then after that there's a third after thing, a supplement. And I start looking at the supplement, and now my jaw drops open in shock, because the supplement consists of Jung analyzing a British science fiction novel called The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. That is the novel that the movie Village of the Damned that we saw earlier was based on. So it was almost as if in that first encounter with Jung, as if he were a holographic wizard bearing a torch, stepping out of the bookcase and saying, yeah, I was looking at that one too, and here's what I thought. And some of his thoughts about the novel had some parallels to ideas I had about the movie. And Jung basically became like my spiritual grandfather or mentor. I was able to understand the singularity archetype only because of the heavy lifting that he had done before on the nature of archetypes. And what's interesting, I'm sure that Jung would have written about this archetype if he had lived long enough, but his exact endpoint was also sort of my exact starting point. So here's the book, Flying Saucers, and this is how it ends. This is a very strange ending of a book, because remember the last part was the supplement on the Midwich Cuckoos, and this is the last line of the book. Thus, the negative end of the story remains a matter of doubt. Well, I think I've solved that doubt, because something that I understood even in 1978 was that visions, when the singularity archetype goes through the personal unconscious of a particular visionary, artist, dreamer, whatever, it may be seen positively or negative, and of course all archetypes have a positive and a negative side, but if it's perceived by the ego, it will seem as this extremely threatening thing. That's how it's perceived in Village of the Damned, and that's why there's a negative ending. Weirdly enough, just yesterday we went to see the movie Annihilation, a new movie by Alex Garland, and that is another movie about the singularity archetype with a negative view of it, and with many parallels to Village of the Damned. I won't talk about in detail because the movie's just come out, so I don't want to create too many plot spoilers, but I also did a video interview with Alex Garland about another of his films that is also a dark view of the singularity archetype, Ex Machina. So you can find that YouTube interview on Reality Sandwich or on zaporacle.com or my YouTube channel. Anyway, so when I first wrote about it in the spring of 1978, I didn't call it the singularity archetype. That name came later. But that paper, just so you can compare what my earliest insights were, is actually on my website, and it's called Archetypes of a New Evolution. When I had just completed writing the book that I held up earlier in 2012, I discovered the writings of Michael Grosso, Dr. Michael Grosso, and we've been in touch frequently since then. I consider him the co-discoverer of the singularity archetype. I first wrote about it in 1978. He started writing about this in a book called The Final Choice, came out in 1985 or 1986, I believe. Recently a new edition came out. So he's a fellow Jungian, doctor, also from New York. He has a PhD in philosophy from Columbia, and he taught philosophy at various colleges and universities. He's now affiliated with the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. His main interest is in consciousness studies and philosophy of mind. He's also an artist. And what I call the singularity archetype, Michael calls ADE, the archetype of death and enlightenment. Now, my book doesn't get into his work as much as it probably should, because, again, I found out after I basically completed the book. So I mentioned him in the acknowledgments, but I didn't discuss his ideas, but you can also read his books for those. But we both relate the same archetype to evolution, death, near-death experience, parapsychology, ufology, psychotropic experience, etc. And so he's read my book. We both agree we're talking about the same archetype. So that was a relief for me to find that somebody with respectable credentials came to basically the same realization that there was a powerful archetype mediating these key event horizons of death and the future evolution of the species. And so I sort of feel like, okay, maybe I'm not the only crazy one out there. So, but we should talk about archetypes first before we talk about the singularity archetype. Archetypes are an idea that goes way back in the Western tradition. We find versions of it in Plato, Philo Judaeus, who's a contemporary of Christ, Johann Kepler, Francis Bacon. It has similarities to British biologist Rupert Sheldrake's idea of morphic forms. He used to call it morphogenetic forms. According to Jung, archetypes are active living dispositions, ideas in the Platonic sense that preform and continually influence our thoughts and feelings and actions. And archetypes are a tough concept to catch hold of, though you've been around them all your life. Classic archetypes of the collective unconscious include the hero, the trickster, the shadow, the mandala, the great mother, and so forth. So archetypes are often misunderstood. They are subjects, not objects or merely patterns. They are psychic organisms or entities that can be said to have their own intentions and a semblance of consciousness. They are superordinate to the phenomenal world of individual manifestations, just like Plato's forms. They are primordial predispositions mediating behavior and experience. They are not intellectual concepts, but living empirical entities charged with both meaning and feeling. They are dynamic living agencies which exert a dominant influence out of which the essential themes of individual and collective human life emerge. Archetypes are inherited modes of functioning akin to instincts. They are not merely in the human psyche, but have analogs in the biological and physical world as well. The archetype, as Jung conceived it, is a precondition and coexistent of life itself. Its manifestations reach not only upwards to the spiritual heights of religion, art, and metaphysics, but also down into the dark realms of organic and inorganic matter. That's a quote from Dr. Anthony Stevens, a Jungian analyst whose work I've only just come across, who's done some pioneering work in bringing the concept of the archetypes back into biology. A lot of the Jungians, like myself, are more friendly with the humanities and have stepped away from some of the more science aspects of archetypes and how they relate to biological evolution. So Dr. Anthony Stevens is the man to go to bring archetypes into the biological world. Jung compared archetypes to the axial patterns of crystals. Like, these are the individual manifestations that are not perfect, but somehow there is this ideal hexagonal pattern that they are organizing themselves into. And Rupert Sheldrake's morphic field work has shown this, that if you have a chemical compound that's never been crystallized before because it's just been invented, it's very hard for it to form a crystal because that pattern's never existed before. But then, once it has crystallized, maybe in a lab in Germany, then if they try the same experiment in a lab in California, now it seems to crystallize much more easily. And it's not that a seed crystal from Germany, across the Atlantic to California, it's as if now that pattern exists in some field of consciousness, it now can more easily pre-pattern matter into that form. Spider webs, they're easy to recognize. They have a classic pattern, but everyone is a little bit different. And so there's some kind of classic predisposition that the spider doesn't have to learn, but that is within it like a biological archetype. So the singularity archetype mediates our expectation and experience of the parallel event horizons of death and eschaton. And eschaton refers to like an endpoint, like a quantum evolutionary shift, a point where the human race is going to cross an event horizon and experience some profound singularity. At least as I'm using the term. The themes of evolutionary transformation of the species implicit in the singularity archetype, which we see especially in science fiction, become phenomenological actualities in many near-death experiences and certain other boundary-dissolving states, such as psychotropic experiences, OBEs, that is out-of-body experiences, dreams, and reported abduction experiences. Just as the individual event horizon of death may be viewed as emergency or emergence, so too is the collective event horizon viewed variously as extinction level event or evolutionary emergence. So again, the bifurcation between those two views has to do with whether the perceiver is located in their ego, which is going to have a more catastrophic and dark view of the singularity archetype, as it will of death, or if the viewer is located in what Jung called the self, which is the totality of all the psychic structures, and is therefore lives in a trans-temporal place that's aware of as a much more multidimensional awareness, and then the same event will seem like a transcendent and evolutionary event. These are two different still shots from the movie 2001. There we see the astronaut Bowman as he's going through a light tunnel that has a lot of parallels to the light tunnel people go through a near-death experience, where he's completely freaked out in a state of ontological shock, and then when he is reborn as the star child on the other side of the event horizon. So archetypes have classic patterns. Joseph Campbell wrote a famous book, probably back in the 1930s, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Of course, he's being numerically modest because there are billions of faces of the hero. And many people in their own life cycle will go through a heroic period where they will go through many of these classic steps that are called the monomyth. You can see them in the story of Moses. You can see them in Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, where you're going to get a call to adventure. There may be a refusal of the call. There's some kind of helper figure may show up, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, and you go through these different steps. And this will be found in all cultures, regardless of separation in both historical period and geography. So a classic presentation of the singularity archetype is a rupture of plane event, or events occur that are an ontological shock for individual or collective ego. That could be a brush with death, or it could be something happening to the species that seems like apocalyptic, or that could threaten the human race with extinction. And it will again be viewed as catastrophic or apocalyptic by the ego, perceived as metamorphic, transcendent, and an evolutionary breakthrough by the self. And what happens is that when you cross the event horizon and encounter the singularity, a shift in all fundamental attributes, such as consciousness, communication, a visual telepathy or a visual telepathic network will be experienced. And that again will be in both near-death experience, where communication is almost always described as telepathic, or in these futuristic visionary projections into the future evolutionary history, or in an ayahuasca circle, for example. Ego will fundamentally change, the sense of body, the sense of self versus other, of subject versus object. Time perception, we will step out of being trapped in linear time. This is one of Einstein's most fundamental points, that linear time is largely an illusion, and this is what you hear from people who've had transcendent experiences. So you get to experience that. Stereotyped gender roles give way to androgynous wholeness. and people will encounter near-death experience of being of light whose gender doesn't seem relevant, and you also see this irrealization of gender in many of these sci-fi stories. Patriarchy and social order will shift. All those attributes that come with that, like money, nation state, power hierarchies, territoriality, and so forth. Visual motifs. This is the cover of the book. Spirals and uncanny eyes are the most classic visual motifs associated with the Singularity archetype. Here's a couple of examples. These are people who did not know anything about my work. This was a painting that I found, or image I found, maybe online, but you can see I wish I could credit the artist, you can see the spiral inside the eye. I found this after the book cover was created, years after. This is a painting by my father from 1951 to about somewhere between 1951 and 1953. I didn't discover it till after the book was published. I didn't discover it till 2015, buried in an attic. And here you see the spirals, and you see a spiral very close to an eye. We're going to look at some other paintings by Nathan Zapp that are relevant. So let me give you a classic. These are two paintings that are images of the Singularity archetype from that bipolar view, from the view of the ego and from the self. And let me give you one of the best full-blown manifestations of the Singularity archetype, because basically when you look at an archetype, there's no place you can go and see the definitive pattern of an archetype. It is more like looking at, I used to be a diamond grader, and you would look through the different facets of a round, brilliant diamond, look at an inclusion inside of it, and through every facet you'd get a different distortion. But if you look through enough facets, you would start to figure out exactly where it is and how big it is and so forth. And so when you're looking at an archetype, the basic Jungian method is to look at many different permutations or manifestations of it, strip out idiosyncrasies that are peculiar just to one version, and see what they have in common and sort of improve the signal to noise ratio thereby. So these two images are to be found in a book that was published right after Jung died. He wrote his part of it just before he died. It's called Man and His Symbols. It was meant to be an introductory work, highly recommended. And in a chapter of that book by Jung's most brilliant colleague, Marie-Louise von Franz, she describes a couple of dreams that were had by what she refers to as a simple Protestant woman in Switzerland. And in the first dream that we'll look at, the dreamer is terrified. She's standing with a spirit guide, and she sees the dark wing of Satan come down and block out the sun. And it seems apocalyptic, and we see pyramids in the background, so it seems sort of like the Middle East where the Antichrist is said to arise, but it's also the scene of many biblical dramas. In the next dream, she is, instead of standing on the earth, which is where the ego stands, she is up in the heavens. This is where the self perceives things. And now what looked like the dark wing of Satan is revealed to be the white wafting cloak of God. And she draws a Jesus who seems like he's waiting to bridge some gap or to reach out toward man, and she paints a spiral. And Marie-Louise von Franz says that the spiral is oriented in such a way that it seems to be inviting the viewer into a different dimension. So to me, this is like the most perfect visual representation of these two views of the Singularity archetype. So now any archetype is going to appear differently to different psyches. And we had what von Franz described as a simple Protestant woman. Now we're going to look at the Singularity archetype through a very different psyche, that of a astrophysicist and atheist, Arthur C. Clarke, and as presented in his novel Childhood's End. And you will start to see incredible parallels between this novel and those two paintings. So just to go through a little bit of the story of Childhood's End, I'm going to have to give you plot spoilers. But let's go back here. Okay. Childhood's End, like Village of the Damned, begins with the appearance of flying saucers, UFOs. And we are told that, that they break through all communications and announce, you can call us the overlords. We are here to assist you in a perilous phase of your evolution. And we are not going to interfere in your affairs except to keep you from killing each other. And through some technological magic, any projectile weapon, from a rifle bullet to a nuclear missile, is automatically returned to sender, so that mass violence becomes impossible. But the overlords, true to their word, act in a very benevolent way. They do not interfere with human freedom, but they give us many priceless gifts of science and technology, tremendously improving the quality of human life. One oddity, though, of their arrival is that they say, we will not physically appear before you for 2 generations, 50 years. And people speculate, well, they must look like giant insects or slime mold or something. They don't want to scare us. Anyway, the 50 years go by, and it's an age of tremendous prosperity, a golden age. And now the great craft land, and when the overlords step out, people are shocked because they look like Christian and pre-Christian devils. They have horns, wings, great ebony wings, tails, and so forth. And this is a fascinating incongruity, because here we have this atheist, a scientist, Arthur C. Clarke, and now an archetype is appearing. The devil is an archetype in the midst of the technological materialism of a science fiction novel. The overlords are not devils. They are exactly who they say they are. They are completely benevolent, more benevolent than human beings. Their unusual appearance is just the physiological adaptation to the environmental conditions of their planet. But, as Clarke explains, they, to the human unconscious, even in the past, their physiognomy, their appearance is associated with evil, because they represent the end of the old species. And Clarke describes it as a race memory of a future event. I mean, it almost sounds like he's talking about an archetype without seeming to know anything about archetypes. So the reason why they're associated with evil is something that relates to why the ego perceives the singularity archetype as dark, in that all organisms are conservative. They're trying to dial in that homeostasis, a certain equilibrium, and anything that threatens that equilibrium, something mutagenic like a poison or radioactivity or a foreign organism entering the body. That's why we have an immune system that will anything that is not in one of an approved microorganism will be attacked. The species and individuals will resist powerful, intense change because it's threatening that homeostasis. So the coming of the overlords is the signal of the end of the old species. So another aspect going on, I'm not sure why this is, maybe we should go back. I'll finally finish Childhood's End. Okay, and we're going to take a quick break here, and I will come back and talk more about Childhood's End. Yeah. So where we left off, the overlords had appeared physically, and people were a bit shocked, but they had also had 50 years of experience that the overlords are exactly who they say they are, that they're completely benevolent. And now, for the first time, the overlords can mix freely in human society. And one of the overlords, Chevrek, starts researching human paranormal phenomenon and documentation of that. What the overlords are looking for is something that they call Subject Zero. That's going to be the first human being that's going to break the mold and be of the new evolutionary type. It's very much like a Arthur C. Clarke's atheistic version of the Messiah. So one of the overlords, Reshevarek, is going to go to the home of the man who has the largest privately held collection of books about the paranormal. A trivia question for older folks in the audience is what American celebrity in real life had the largest collection of books about the paranormal? The answer is Jackie Gleason, the man who Richard Nixon, according to Jackie Gleason's widow, took him to see the frozen bodies of aliens, according to her. Anyway, so Reshevarek goes to the home of a man who has this library, and the man plans a weekend guest situation with some of his close friends showing up because they sort of want the celebrity name-dropping chance to meet an overlord, which very few people have gotten to encounter in such an informal social situation. Now, what's amazing about this part of the novel is how much this social situation sounds like a prophetic anticipation in 1953 of the contemporary New Age era, and with a lot of the foibles present. And there are certain, and with some of the narcissistic shadow of it too. And so there are certain sort of New Age entertainments involved. One of them is a session with the Ouija board. Before these guests arrive, however, Reshevarek has his alien speed reading ability worked his way through all or most of this guy's library, and he kind of sighs, as many contemporary readers of such literature might, at how much is nonsense or poorly written or poorly thought through and so forth, and he's kind of just feels some negativity or regret about the mysticism that plagues the human mind, as he put it. Obviously, this is, Arthur C. Clarke's dislike of mysticism is speaking through this alien character. Anyway, so Reshevarek is observing the session with the Ouija board, and they ask the Ouija board the classic question, "Who are you?" And the planchette spells out I-A-M-A-L-L, I am all, which is a perfect synonym basically for the collective unconscious. And then they ask, what are the coordinates of the overlord's sun from their planetary system? And this is information that the overlords have never released. And it spells out the correct coordinates. And now Reshevarek, a bit naively for anyone with experience in the paranormal, concludes that subject zero must be present, because how else could this information be known? Of course, assuming that no other human being could have a psychic ability except subject zero, I guess. But when he looks around the table, all the adults there seem perfectly mediocre, which in fact they actually seem to be. And what he discovers is that one of the women present is pregnant, and it is her unborn fetus who is subject zero. When this child is born, he immediately exhibits profound paranormal abilities like levitation, and also, as if a seed crystal has been dropped in, every child born after him is also of this new type. And so now all these infants form a telepathic network. They become aware of each other all over the world, and start doing very strange things. Also, what happens is, after a critical number of these new children are born, the old species, Homo sapiens, us in other words, becomes sterile. It's as if now that they have fulfilled a biological program, an evolutionary program to give birth to their successor species, they are no longer needed to reproduce, hence the title, Childhood's End. Now, what happens is, cutting a whole lot out of the story, is we flash forward maybe decades, and one human being has managed to smuggle himself aboard one of the Overlord spacecraft when it's returning to their home planet. And because of time dilation, by the time he's there and they can bring him back to Earth, decades have passed. And the Overlords want to bring him back to Earth because he is now the only Homo sapien left. All the others have aged and died. And they want him as a member of the original species that has undergone this evolutionary metamorphosis, they want to see how the next phase of the children's evolution looks to him, a human observer. And because basically what the overlords are sent to various planets when they are about to undergo a critical evolutionary quantum shift across the evolutionary event horizon. They themselves, though far more advanced than Homo sapiens, are, as they describe it, stillborn in the sense that they are sterile, in the sense that they are not able to make this evolutionary leap. And this is why they are the perfect midwives, because they're at a very high level of evolution but cannot themselves participate. And basically, Clarke has a naturalistic, atheistic God concept in the book called The Overmind, that's sort of a vast disembodied intelligence. I don't know what the difference between that is and a more reasonable God concept, but that's aware of intelligence or consciousness developing in any world, aware of when it's going to arrive at this critical phase where it could easily be destroyed or spread destruction to the stars. And then it will send the overlords to act as midwives, which is interesting because it sounds like midwitch cuckoos, midwives, to help with this precarious jump to a much higher species. So to the last human observer left alive who's brought back to the surface of the earth, when the children who, before they reach this phase, translocate to a continent, so they all join hands together and form something like, it's called the long dance. It's something like a moving spiral on the ground. But then when they are going to complete their new phase of their evolution and join energetically with the overmind, so the last human being left alive, it looks like an aurora borealis, a spiral of light in the sky. So this is pretty amazing, because remember I said that we were going to juxtapose Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End with the dreams of the Christian woman. Okay, so the dark wing of Satan in both versions of this singularity archetype comes down because the overlords have the dark wing of Satan, and that's frightening to human observers. But from a cosmic vantage that the last human observer left alive is able to see, the children merge with the overmind, and it looks like an aurora borealis, a white spiral of light in the sky. So you see how the incredible parallelism that exists there, and in many other variations. For example, here's the simplest version of the singularity archetype, where you get the dual vision that I can ever think of. This was at a festival a dozen years ago or so. A young man told me about a dream he had where, I do free dream interpretation at certain festivals, by the way. He had a dream where he's out in the forest and the sky becomes incredibly dark and there's an earthquake and it feels like the whole planet is being shaken to bits. It feels like Armageddon, the end of the world. And now, and then suddenly there is a break in the dark canopy of clouds. A beautiful beam of sunlight comes through, and an eagle comes spiraling down this beam of sunlight, and in its talons is a glowing golden egg, and it deposits the glowing golden egg on the top of a tree. So you see the same elements there with the dark apocalyptic event that's terrifying to him, and then you have this transcendent event, again with a spiral, the eagle, which has the best eyes in nature, and is associated with the heavens and so forth. It flies, and it's bringing a glowing golden egg, a symbol of rebirth in a new golden age. And so the examples go on and on. A key aspect of the singularity archetype, and again, whether it is experienced in a futuristic vision, like in a sci-fi vision, or experienced in an out-of-body experience, a near-death experience, and many psychedelic experiences, is the emergence, corporeal reality is transcended, and there's emergence of a glorified body. This is a famous painting by William Blake. An example of where we see the emergence of the glorified body in a science fiction mythology, and science fiction, this is where the mythology of the present era is being created and being discovered and experienced by many people for the most part. The movie Avatar. At the start of the movie Avatar, many people don't remember, but we start with a disembodied view of something flying over a rainforest. This is actually the paraplegic, marine, having something between a lucid dream and an out-of-body experience. I think it's described as a dream. In the dream, he is in a kind of virtual, glorified dream body, and he's flying over the rainforest, and he's being liberated from a tragic corporeal scenario in which he feels trapped, in which he is this vital young man with all this physical courage and a very physical guy, but he's in a wheelchair because of a war injury. So then there is an extremely numinous moment, and it's clear that it's numinous for Jake, when he is shown the avatar, when he is shown the super body that he's going to be able to merge with through a technological process. And this technological process looks visually incredibly like death, because he's going to get into this coffin-like sarcophagus, and then through whatever process, he is somehow put into this magnificent avatar body. And it's a very ecstatic experience, at least for him. In the film, there's a bit of an unfortunate technological materialist bias, because the telepathic merger that exists between Jake and this animal has to be done through like the organic equivalent of an Ethernet cable, this funny tail thing or whatever. But there's a lot of telepathic bonding that goes on in the film. And this is another aspect of the Singularity archetype that I call homogestalt and a visual telepathic network. This is the remake of the movie Village of the Damned. And there's some really fascinating synchronicities involving the actors who basically personify the ego, the Dr. Zellaby, in the first version and in the second version. The second version is played by Christopher Reeve, who also played Superman, and shortly after this film came out, or maybe shortly after it got done shooting, he became a paraplegic or quadriplegic. And I talk about that in the book. Okay, so here are the children. Their telepathic network in the book is by gender. So all the males are aware of the same thing, and all the females. It's segregated by gender. The term homogestalt for this type of networked telepathy is one I got from a classic science fiction novel, also from the 1950s, by Ted Sturgeon, called More Than Human. In it, a group of mutants who are all quite different from each other form a small telepathic network, and with specialized functions. So it's like one is the executive function, and maybe another one is like the conscience or superego, and so forth. And we see this telepathic network thing in Childhood's End, of course. We already covered that. It's a very powerful version of it is in the classic science fiction's greatest masterpiece, in my opinion, Dune by Frank Herbert. And the original Dune books, highly recommended. A lot of stuff about the Singularity archetype. The way it works in the Dune books is that there is a sisterhood of superconscious warrior women called the Bene Gesserit, and they are working on, through manipulating politics and manipulating royal families, they are trying to breed, they're trying to advance human evolution and create a being they call the Kwisatz Haderach, which would be sort of a male version of a Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother. And the name literally means something like he who can be all places at once. It's somebody who will transcend ego consciousness. And the way homogestalt occurs with the Bene Gesserits is to become a Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother, which is the higher caste of the Bene Gesserit. One must undergo a potentially lethal and highly dangerous rite of initiation called the Water of Life. You swallow a deadly poison, And either you are able to convert that poison in your body, or you die. If you do survive the rite, then you become a homo gestalt. You become aware of all the memories and personalities of all the other Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers, living or dead, who have similarly survived this rite. This image is what it looks like inside of Paul Atreides' mind when he's the first male, because he is the Kwisatz Haderach, to survive the Water of Light initiation. And you can see him floating in this cosmic space, but it looks kind of like both a spiral and an eye. And this is part of Paul's initiation. Here's a painting. I met the artist as well at a festival. And look how much this looks like a homo gestalt. Here we have this like boundary dissolution. We have these different faces, and it looks sort of like nerve axons or something coming off of them and sort of merging together into a spiral, a cosmic spiral. So that is a great image of homo gestalt. Here we have an ayahuasca ceremony. I've written about it's one of my ayahuasca experiences. You can find it on Reality Sandwich on my website. It's called something like Agonizing Enlightenment of Ayahuasca. I didn't quite experience a telepathic network, though there were some telepathic feelings involved, but a common experience in ayahuasca circles is a kind of group telepathy. And early anthropologists who observed ayahuasca circles even called the substance telepathy because the telepathic effects were fairly common. And apparently what would happen in many cases is the ayahuasquero, sort of like the shamanic facilitator, would sing certain songs, and people in the circle would all have a common synesthetic visual experience. They would see the song and they would all see the same thing and be able to comment on it together and confirm that they had all seen the same thing. So that's a really good example, because it's not only telepathic network, it's visual. And this is an important thing to point out, because conventionally people think of telepathy as I hear your thoughts, which doesn't seem much better than the little mouth noises that we make now, or calling somebody on the telephone. A much more profound version of telepathy would involve every communication mode. So an example of that would be mutual dreaming, which is a rare phenomenon, but it does occur. As a dream interpreter, many people have brought me examples. I've had one experience of that myself, and that is where people share a dream and experience a dream together. This is, an amazingly exaggerated version of this is presented in the movie Inception. But sometimes the mutual dreaming experience will happen when somebody is dying. So there's a case, for example, where a woman was traveling by train to her father's deathbed. She's on the train and falls asleep, and she has a dream where that involves her father, and where there's archetypal content, like she gives him a golden key or something like that. And when she gets to the deathbed, the father says, when you came to me last night and gave me the golden key or something, that really meant a lot to me. So if you think about mutual dreaming, and if you think about what would be a quantum evolutionary shift, or you think about what was the last great quantum evolutionary shift, it was almost certainly the ability of Homo sapiens to think and speak in words, something that we are able to manipulate symbolic language far more profoundly than any other animal. There are animals that have some ability in that way, but don't seem to to the extent that we do. And so it would seem like, I talk about this more in the book, that the latent capacity for verbal communication must have been developing in the brain for a long time. But I at least speculate that some environmental shock, some hominid group under acute environmental pressure may have been willing to violate the homeostasis, the group equilibrium, and develop language as a survival adaptation. Another way that it could have come into being, because these new evolutionary capacities emerge episodically before they become dominant for the whole group. And that's why paranormal phenomenon is usually an episodic thing. But it's also, as William James pointed out around the turn of the century, all that's necessary to disprove the notion that all crows are black is one white crow. So if we have one valid instance of telepathy in human history, one mother remote from sensory information who knows specifically how her kid is in trouble, that blows open that possibility. That must be part of the structure of reality. Many of us have experienced many such white crow phenomenon, but I believe it may take a tremendous environmental stress or some new catalyst, something like virtual reality, I think has the ability to, may prove to have the ability to enhance certain paranormal abilities. I think that we probably, from off-the-shelf hardware we have now, could, in many people, using virtual reality technology, even in its present primitive stage, create out-of-body experiences on demand. So these are examples of some of the things that could then catalyze something that occurs only episodically and have it become emergent for the whole species as a much more dominant element. So if you think about what would be the next advance, because an advance in consciousness always means an advance in communication. A profound advance in communication means an advance in consciousness. I had a social studies teacher in high school who caught my attention when he said, the movies are the queen of the arts. And then he went on to explain that movies subsume any other known art form, because a movie is based on a piece of writing, a screenplay. You can have dance, you can have song, paintings on the walls. Anything can be put, any form of art can be put in a movie. Well, any form of human communication could be put into, say, a mutual dreaming situation, because you can still talk to somebody in a mutual dream. You can still you can communicate through any way that we can communicate now. So that would seem like it would be the richest form of communication. So the telepathy is likely to involve the visual as well as auditory, and it could involve an entire virtual situation that is created like in a mutual dream as a way of communicating psychological content. This is another image I found online. My website shouldn't be there because I didn't create it, but you see these people, it looks almost like Childhood Zen, kind of going into this concentric spiral, and it feels like they're all merging together in a luminous center there. Here's one of my dad, Nathan Zapp's paintings from 1979, and you see like these Janus-headed beings. Here's a spiral, and it seems like they're all kind of like meeting in a middle there. This is another Nathan Zapp painting from 1977, and this looks to me like suggestive of a Homo gestalt. This would have been a year before I started writing my first paper, Archetypes of a New Evolution. So another aspect of the crossing the event horizon and the singularity archetype is you emerge into an idioplastic or thought-responsive matrix. And we saw that, of course, in the movie The Matrix, but this is what happens every night when we dream. When you dream, you're entering this idioplastic environment where you're not limited by linear time and where everything is reflecting psychological content. This also happens with near-death experience, lucid dreaming, and some of the pioneer OBE explorers like Robert Monroe and others have gone into astral realms, according to them, and have found these idioplastic environments, like in the afterlife realm, where a group of fundamentalists will have sort of congregated together, and let's say Christian evangelicals, and they'll create a sort of a white picket fence town with a church and so forth that accommodates as much as possible what they expected to find in the afterlife. But there was still, according to what Robert Monroe experienced in these environments, there were still people who were like, but where's Jesus? I thought Jesus was supposed to be in heaven, and so forth. So according to many different mystical sources, the Tibetans, for example, in some of their books about how to get the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying and so forth, how to get through these afterlife bardos, people are often unprepared for an idioplastic environment in which what they think becomes real, or where they may aggregate with others who have similar expectations and create an environment. So this happens in the science fiction stories with where one finds oneself in an idioplastic environment, like in the Matrix. It happens a lot with ufological phenomena, and that's why a flying saucer may appear differently to different observers at the same time. It seems to be these objects seem more idioplastic than fully physical, at least as we conventionally think of the physical. This is the environment that Alice finds herself in Alice in Wonderland. So if we look at quantum evolutionary shifts in the biological past, one of the most amazing is called the Cambrian explosion. And 544 million years ago, there were 3 animal phyla of life. And then, just 6 million years later, in that scale of time, not a pretty thin slice of time, 538 million years ago, there was 38 phyla of animal life, the same number as exists today. And so this is called the Cambrian explosion. And one of the theories of what caused it that Andrew Parker came up with and wrote about it, a British zoologist, I think, wrote about it in a book called In the Blink of an Eye, is called the light switch theory. He's an Oxford University zoologist. And basically what Andrew Parker says is that when eyes evolved, that was when you had this explosion of evolutionary novelty, because now when animals could see each other, now you could have predator and prey, and now you had to have all these different kinds of adaptations, and all kinds of things become possible. This is extremely interesting because the eye and an enhanced visual communication is a key part of the singularity archetype, and that's why eyes are symbolic of the singularity archetype. Okay, a huge shift, cultural shift, maybe not quite a quantum evolutionary shift, but a huge shift in human culture happened sometime after the late Paleolithic. And we're going to take a quick break, but Riane Eisler is a social historian, wrote about this amazing shift in a book called The Chalice and the Blade. So Riane Eisler was interested in something that other people like Joseph Campbell and Terence McKenna were interested in. What caused this great change where we shifted from what Riane called partnership societies to dominator societies? And that era of dominator societies, basically the patriarchal era in which we still live, was a profound change that started something about 6 millennia ago and happened at slightly different times, but swept through the whole planet. And so Riane is a cultural historian and systems scientist. Anthropologist Ashley Montague praised this book as the most important book since Darwin's Origin of the Species. So partnership societies, their iconic object is the chalice. That is a chalice from ancient Crete, which was, I think, the most recent of the partnership societies. And the Chalice and the Blade presents the theory that the partnership model of social organization characterized Neolithic Europe and lasted up until the time of the Bronze Age civilization of Minoan Crete. Partnership societies were characterized by relatively egalitarian relations between the sexes, goddess worship, and life-affirming values. The emblematic object of this era was the chalice, which symbolized abundance, feminine values, fecundity, liquid and solid food nourishment, and the goddess. Then we shift to the dominator societies. The end of the partnership era came with the invasion of patriarchal tribes built on the dominator model, which is characterized by strict hierarchies, men dominating women, and death-centric values represented by the sword, the new iconic emblematic object. Joseph Campbell schematized the ancient shift from matriarchy to patriarchy as follows. And of course, Joseph Campbell is a Jungian mythologist. The world born of goddess without consort, the world born of a goddess fecundated by a consort, a male consort, the world fashioned from the body of a goddess by a male warrior god, the world created by the unaided power of a male god alone. The Abrahamic faiths, in other words. This was actually summarized by, well, this is Joseph Campbell's idea, but summarized by Carolyn Heilbrunn. And now, an amazing theory is presented in this book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess, by Leonard Shlain. And Dr. Leonard Shlain, who died in 2009, was a vascular surgeon, an author, an inventor. He was the chairperson of laparoscopic surgery at the California Pacific Medical Center, and an associate professor of surgery at the University of California. He operated on blood vessels near the brain. He knew a lot about the structure of the brain and hemispheric lateralization, which it will play into this. That's the difference between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Now that difference is more complicated and various than is usually presented, but for the purposes of this discussion, I will talk about it in a more simplified way. So as Shlain illustrates, quickly following the adoption of a written alphabet, he believes that the adoption of written alphabets was what took away the goddess-worshipping partnership societies. Once the society adopts a written alphabet, goddesses are eliminated, women are forbidden to preside over religious rituals or even to participate at all. It becomes a male priesthood. Women become second-class citizens or disposable property. A text of some sort becomes the ruling principle. In the beginning was the Word. Also, interestingly, as Shlain points out, clerics of various cultures would tend to wear black and white, the colors of ink and paper. The text could be religious, like the Bible or the Quran. Clerics, okay, I mentioned that. Or the text could be secular, like Hammurabi's Code, the Communist Manifesto, the Rule of Law, the U.S. Constitution, the DSM, the Diagnostic Service Manual. I think we're up to 4 or something. Which my writing mentor at NYU, Yale Doctoral, called the industrialized form of storytelling. So we still live in the era of where text is dominant. Everyone is talking about the Second Amendment and constitutional rights, or they're thumping Bibles, or they're talking about the rule of law. And so we are still very much in that era. Shlain points out that the second of the 10 Commandments is about not having images. We have to drop down to the 6th commandment before we find a prohibition against murder. This is from Exodus 24. The 2nd commandment reads, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is in the water under the earth." The 2nd commandment is popularly interpreted as being against idol worship, but is actually a ban on all representational art. This taboo is repeated throughout the Torah. For example, from Deuteronomy, "Take ye therefore good heed unto yourselves, lest ye corrupt yourselves and make you a graven image. The similitude of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any beast that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged fowl that flieth in the air, the likeness of anything that creepeth on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the waters beneath the earth." So clearly the 2nd commandment is not just a ban on idols. However, the etymology of the word idol is interesting and relevant. Idol derives from the Latin word idolum, and idolum derives from eidolon, the Greek word for image. Yahweh's first instruction to Adam in Genesis is to attach word labels to things, to name things. And this is what gives him dominance over the natural world. It is Adam's left hemisphere ability to name things that entitles him to dominion over them. So Shlain finds a left hemisphere bias in Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Because remember, his theory is that when written alphabets cause a shift in hemispheric dominance to favor the left hemisphere, and that's what triggers the dominator societies. And this is Leonard Shlain talking about the Abrahamic faiths. Each is an exemplar of patriarchy. Each monotheistic religion features an imageless father deity whose authority shines through his revealed word, sanctified in written form. All three of the Abrahamic faiths have intense anti-image phases. For example, in Christianity, in the 8th century, a sect arose that so despised images that its members declared an all-out war against statues and paintings. They called themselves the iconoclasts, which means image destroyers. Pope Leo III ordered all church murals covered with plaster and all likenesses of the Virgin effaced. Their targets also included painters, sculptors, and craftsmen. Monks who resisted were blinded and had their tongues torn out. Then we have the Protestant Reformation. There's Martin Luther over there. And that begins with a new document, Luther's Manifesto. He creates this document and nails it to the door of the church. He reduces the role of Mary, the one feminine element that had crept into Christianity. And churches become more visually bland with Protestantism. But now we go to the most recent of the Abrahamic faiths, and as Shlain explains, the more recent the faith, the more recent will be the anti-image faiths. And with Islam, the most recent by far of the Abrahamic faiths, the anti-image bias continues into the present era. Okay? So in Islam is against all representational art, but especially images of the prophet. A few cartoons in Sweden result in more than 100 people killed in various countries. Fundamentalist regimes enforce Sharia law, which is patriarchal, anti-female, the worst human rights disaster on the planet by far. There's nothing that's even close to it. And the treatment of women, is the treatment of women by Islamic fundamentalism. The burqa, a more profound oppression than genital mutilation. It's a castration of a human being's ability to communicate visually, which we do with our faces in a way that no other animal does. We have 150 muscles in our face, and we are microsecond by microsecond communicating through these facial expressions. So this is more profound than genital mutilation in eliminating the ability for a woman to communicate visually. To give you an idea how bad this can be, in 2002, a fire in a school in the holy city of Mecca, Saudi Arabia, was attended by morality police, who are also known as the Commission for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. The morality police fatally interfered with firemen and others trying to help a school with girls inside of it that was on fire. They kept the girls inside the burning building because they were not wearing headscarves and abayas, the black robes, as required by the kingdom's strict interpretation of Islam. A witness saw 3 morality policemen beating young girls to prevent them from leaving the school because they were not wearing the abaya. The morality police also stopped men trying to help the girls, warning that it is sinful to approach them. 15 girls died in the blaze. On the other hand, this is the least violent era in human history, the lowest per capita rates of homicide and war casualty. A profound hemispheric shift is underway and accelerating. As the great media guru Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. I would add, but especially neurologically. Most of the modern rise in the rights of women correlates with the rise of television. Regardless of objectionable content such as first-person shooter video games, visual media shifts hemispheric dominance from the left to the right. And no other generations but the ones of today have been exposed to so much visual media in such a visually intense and complex environment. And we've gone from people experiencing total shock when they showed the first silent movies. I think the first one shown in public was of a train pulling into a station and people were diving for their chairs because they couldn't even process that such a large moving image didn't correspond to reality. When they came up with the first zoom lens, because at first they only had fixed focal length lenses and they zoomed in on a woman's face, in the film, people were gasping in the audience because it looked like the woman's face was expanding and was going to explode or something. Meanwhile, we've got two boys in the house who are 10 and 13. When they were like maybe 5 and 8, I watched an Avengers film with them, and in the opening sequence there was this surreal montage with editing quick enough to give you an epileptic seizure, and they both completely followed and instantly decoded the entire story that was behind that montage with no problem, because they've grown up in this incredibly visually sophisticated environment. So so this is a t-shirt somebody gave me. Can you see what I'm saying? And you see an eye at the center of it with what looks like the aperture of a camera, the iris of a camera in there. Terence McKenna referenced Philo Judaeus, a first century Alexandrian Jew, contemporary of Christ, who said a more perfect logos, a more perfect version of the voice of God, would be beheld rather than heard. And so besides technological changes emerging episodically in spontaneous and organic ways, we have stuff like ayahuasca, telepathic synesthesia we talked about, and mutual dreaming. So this is what happens in the evolution of technology, not surprisingly, parallels what's going on with organic evolution with human beings. Sophocles said, "Nothing vast enters the life of mortals without a curse." And some already lose their lives in the new technology and become idiots, but a lot of the things that are said about computers and video games and smartphones are almost identical to things that people like Socrates said about the technology of writing when it was introduced, that it made people stupid and they'd lose their memories and so forth. And of course, every new technology is a sword that cuts both ways, and there'll be devastatingly harmful things happen on the internet, but incredibly miraculously good things happen as well. And we may soon be able to use off-the-shelf VR equipment to produce OBEs on demand, as I pointed out earlier. And in general, people have sometimes asked me, what should we do to prepare to be able to cross the event horizon? And it's the same thing that would help you cross the event horizon of death as would help you cross the future evolutionary event horizon, as would help you tonight when you go to sleep and cross the event horizon into a dimension called the dream time, and that is being able to function and to keep your awareness and your self-awareness while in an idioplastic, visually rich, shape-shifting environment. Another principle is that I've come up with is that as novelty intensifies, and I agree with Terence McKenna, who got the idea from Alfred North Whitehead, that the universe prefers and conserves novelty, the creation of new forms. As novelty intensifies, the outer edge of light and dark will likely both intensify. And so you can think of novelty as occurring as the amplitude between those widened extremes. So as we have these powerful new virtual technologies and start to hybridate more with computers and so forth, there are going to be diabolical things that will happen, but there are also going to be transcendently evolutionary things that happen, as is already the case. ISIS may use the internet, but so may people with unusual sexualities who in the past would be completely terrified and isolated and suffering in a small town, but now they can find a community of people all over the world. So technology will continue to be a sword that cuts both ways, and that is part of its purpose, because if it's all good or it's bad, that's not as novel as if it's both. Okay, and I get into this dual aspect more in the book. Other aspects of the quantum evolutionary shift, an explosion of new mythological manifestation of the singularity archetype, especially in fantasy and sci-fi cultural products. Image of the singularity archetype are ubiquitous in contemporary culture. I mean, you can find them in the distant past, but it seems to be an archetype that is becoming more charged and more emergent and powerful all the time. And part of this is also, we'll get into this here, with the change in NDE research, accelerating research on psychotropics and other states of non-ordinary consciousness. And again, when we're able to start producing states of non-ordinary consciousness, we can already, but even more profoundly with virtual reality, equipment. I think that's going to be a powerful catalyst. An explosion of research in NDEs since 1975. That was when Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, came out. That's when the terms near-death experience and life review were coined. And at the same time that that has happened, this increasing awareness of NDEs and well-credentialed researchers studying near-death experience, people like Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist who wrote the single best book called Consciousness Beyond Life, highly recommended. At the same time, there's been this explosion of resuscitation technology, even just in the last few years, to where now they say that if the Titanic were to happen today, they'd be able to come by hours later and restart most of those people that were lying dead in the water. Okay? So what we're having is a far greater percentage of the population, plus the increase in the global population. You have more people than have ever existed in the past who've had experience of crossing the event horizon of death. You know, it's called near-death experience, but some people object to that term because these are people who've met every clinical definition of death and then come back. So NDEs involve crossing the event horizon, and the futuristic images of humanity's further evolution, such as telepathically networked homogestalt glorified bodies, transcending linear time and ego, enhanced visual perception and communication, emergence into an idioplastic matrix. These are the common phenomenological actualities of NDEs. And the evidence that consciousness is not reducible to biochemical process in the brain, that it doesn't require a functioning brain. See the Pam Reynolds case in my book, and in other cases, I believe it is strong enough to be called incontrovertible at this point, even though in a materialist culture where many sophisticated people are neurological materialists, this new evidence is ignored because it doesn't work with their belief system or paradigm. And this is an aspect of scientism where it's really a matter of an irrational belief that's not in accord with the empirical evidence we have. NDEs create, as we see in the futuristic sci-fi fantasies, abilities that become actualities when people have experienced NDEs. So this is from Dr. Pim van Lommel's book, Consciousness Beyond Life. His prospective studies of people who had near-death experience, he had a control group because he studied the people who experienced cardiac arrest in several Dutch hospitals. The control group was people who had cardiac arrest and no NDE, and so those groups could be compared. But his results were, the methodology was impeccable enough that they were published in the prestigious medical journal Lancet. So this is a table that shows you how certain paranormal abilities increased after an NDE and as compared to the general population. Another aspect of the NDEs that Dr. Kenneth Ring, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Connecticut, has written about is in a book called Mindsight, is the ability for people who are congenitally blind since birth to have visual near-death experiences. People who had never experienced vision. And the paranormal vision that people can have in near-death experiences can include not just 360-degree vision, but sometimes spherical vision. And sometimes, once again, it can happen to those who are blind from birth. So what Dr. Ring says is these experiences reflect a purposive intelligence and that they are part of an accelerating evolutionary current that is propelling the human race toward higher consciousness and heightened spirituality. That's what he said in the book, The Major Project, published in the 1980s. The near-death experience is highly structured, and it really suggests an archetype, because one of the things that researchers have discovered is that the effects of the near-death experience actually increase in time. If it was simply a trauma or hallucination, they expect should diminish through time. But if it's an archetype, which is a living entity, your experience doesn't finish with the single experience. You are online with a powerful energy source in the collective unconscious. And Dr. Ring understood it as having a teleological, goal-oriented, evolutionary aspect. This is Dr. Ring again. Effects of the NDE increase over time, suggesting an archetypal encounter, purposive intelligence, and evolutionary current, and point toward the singularity archetype. Teleological, especially the singularity archetype. Teleological evolution is considered disreputable amongst neo-Darwinist evolutionists. Darwin himself, however, was a supporter of orthogenesis, which is basically a synonym of teleological evolution. Darwin felt that evolution had a purpose. And you can see chapter 9 of my book, some dynamic paradoxes to consider when viewing the singularity archetype in an evolutionary context. So all archetypes are like a Janus head. They have a light and a dark aspect. When the singularity archetype pathologizes, we get some very unpleasant effects. All archetypes can inspire, but they can also possess people and take over their lives in unpleasant ways. When possessed, people become inflated. Their ego, they're in touch with this powerful energy source, so their egos can become incredibly inflated and they can become highly neurotic. Possessed by the singularity archetype, people become filled with a messianic desire to proselytize and may become a danger to themselves and others. And an example of archetype inspiration and possession is Michael Jackson, who was both inspired and possessed by the Pura Aeternus archetype, the archetype of the eternal youth. And this is the same archetype that may have inspired Michelangelo to carve David. It inspired Michael Jackson's incredible creativity and exuberant imagination, and he did a lot for children's causes and had a great love for children. But there was a dark side, because he publicly identified himself with Peter Pan. And Peter Pan, by the way, I've just written something recently about an archetype I call the Pan Rebel. Peter Pan is actually the dark side of this archetype. The light side I call a Pan Bodhisattva. This is work I haven't published yet, so it'll hopefully be explained better in the future. But Peter Pan, even in the original book, is a pretty dark character. He's the only one that doesn't grow up in Neverland. The other boys age, and he is very interested in murder and in having people killing each other, because he sees that a lot very fun and adventurous. There's also a book called Neverland by somebody who's researched the life of J.M. Barrie, and it turns out that he was quite a dark character in a lot of ways, and found a family with some young boys that he had a very manipulative relationship with, and manipulated becoming their guardian when their parents died. So there's a lot of darkness in the Peter Pan mythology that a lot of people don't recognize. It's a pretty fascinating subject. But so Michael Jackson consciously identified with Peter Pan and called his ranch Neverland. And to attempt to evade aging, he slept in a hyperbaric chamber, and he endangered his health with extreme plastic surgeries, like a materialist way of trying to achieve a glorified body in his present corporeal body. And he had sleepovers with underage kids, depending on who you believe. They may have been abusive relationships. Certainly had to pay out huge settlements. So the singularity archetype often pathologizes as apocalypticism. And apocalypticism is one of the most persistent habits of the human psyche, and it dates back at least to the beginnings of recorded history. For example, this is a quote that sounds like it could have been written by an evangelical yesterday. Our earth is degenerate in these later days. There are signs that the world is speedily coming to an end. That was written on an Assyrian clay tablet in 2800 BC. So Mircea Eliade is a Romanian historian and philosopher, said the myth of the end of the world is of universal occurrence. It is already to be found among primitive peoples still at a Paleolithic stage of culture, and it recurs in the great historic civilizations Babylonian, Indian, Mexican, and Greco-Roman. So that strongly suggests an archetype, and that's why it can be cross-cultural. It lives in the collective unconscious shared by all of humanity. Apocalypticism often results from the conflation of the two parallel event horizons that the singularity relates to, eschaton and death. And this is the classic confusion of inner and outer that plagues human beings. For an end date to be popular, it needs to be slated before the expected lifetime of its adherents runs out. So if you read the book of Revelation, it's clearly apparent that it's talking about a second coming in the 1st century AD. That's why Jesus says, there are some of you here today who will not know death. But of course that's been reinterpreted so that it can keep getting projected out into the future. Now, Sir Isaac Newton, sort of unproductively, in my opinion, spent a very large part of his later life studying the book of Revelation and trying to come up with an end date. And eventually he came up with the date 2050, I believe. Notice you don't hear much about it, even though it's so amazing that one of the greatest scientists of all ages was an apocalypticist. The reason is that 2050 is not a sexy end date because it's too far out. Nobody wants to wait that long for it. 2012 was a very exciting end date as we started to get close to it, because people were looking for some kind of dramatic New Age rapture or whatever to happen in a conveniently close time. You don't want to hear about an end date that is longer than your expected lifetime. But I guarantee you that, in 2040, thereabouts, you're going to start to see books like The Newton Code, and there'll start to be movies about Isaac Newton and why he predicted that date. It'll become a sexy date then. Elizabeth Steam was a self-styled clairvoyant who predicted that a massive earthquake would occur in the Bay Area on August 14th of 1969. And after she made this prediction, and she was, I don't think she was a clairvoyant for a living, she was more or less a homemaker, and she was quite sincere about her premonition, because at great expense she had moved her whole family from the Bay Area to, I think, Spokane, Washington. And many other psychics in a copycat fashion picked up the same date and said that they saw it too, what happened on that date. And it was such a big phenomenon, there were several New York Times articles about it. But shortly before the predicted massive earthquake, Elizabeth Steam died at the age of 29 of a usually non-fatal form of lupus. So she may have confused a sense of her oncoming personal event horizon with a collective event, because human beings are constantly confusing inner and outer, and this is the most familiar in the state of projection, where something like, the most classic example is we have a heterosexual man walking down the street, sees a beautiful woman, and he feels like, I've known her from other lifetimes, we were meant to be, she's the one. Now, from the Jungian point of view, this man is projecting his soul, which will tend to be characterized, be more feminine than his conscious physical gender, and so he will feel this sense of having known this woman and of their having been together for lifetimes, because he's probably been with his own soul for lifetimes. In some case, this might be projected onto an actual soulmate, in which case we might say there was a hook in her for the projection or something, but it could make this person into a stalker, or very obnoxious, or having inappropriate expectations, archetypal expectations of an actual person. And this is the commonplace, phenomenon of infatuation and so forth. Here's another example of pathological possession by the singularity archetype, the most fully developed one I know of, and that is the Heaven's Gate UFO cult. This is the front page, the homepage of their website, which is still up. And you notice that the name suggests is sort of like a pseudo-biblical synonym for saying event horizon, Heaven's Gate. And this UFO cult, many people will remember, is famous for a mass suicide of 39 of its members in 1997. Heaven's Gate began in the early 1970s when Marshall Applewhite, who was recovering from a heart attack, claimed to have had a near-death experience. Applewhite came to believe that he and his nurse, Monty Nettles, were the two witnesses spoken of in the book of Revelation. Besides Heaven's Gate, the group also called itself HIM, an acronym meaning Human Individual Metamorphosis. Their material is just dripping with motifs and key aspects of the singularity archetype, but in a dimension form. The group believed that the Earth was about to be recycled, and that the only way was to survive was to get off the planet. They felt there was a mothership that was hiding behind the Hale-Bopp comet. And one of the paths to get off planet was to thoroughly hate this world. This is somewhat of a pathologized version of Gnosticism, and reject the present vessel or flesh and blood body. So here we have a pathologized version of the will toward the glorified body I talked about earlier. 7 members of the group, including Applewhite, were so eager to free themselves from sexual desire that they had themselves surgically castrated. In 1997, Applewhite claimed that a UFO was trailing the Hale-Bopp comet and waiting to take them to a level of existence above human. On March 24th of 1997, 39 members of the group, dressed in identical black uniforms, brand new black and white Nike Windrunner athletic shoes, and triangular arm patches labeled Heaven's Gate Away Team, an obvious reference to Star Trek, committed suicide with a lethal combination of phenobarbital, vodka, and plastic bags tied around their heads. So they, to try and get to this eschaton-like cosmic event horizon, they chose the other event horizon of death. Most or all of the classic elements related to the singularity archetype, evolutionary metamorphosis, NDE, death, UFOs, androgyny, the glorified body, and science fiction saturated the Heaven's Gate cult. The logo for the group depicts a keyhole-shaped stargate above a spiral of white clouds. Let's go back to that for a second. This one we don't. Well, here we see the spiral of clouds down there, like a hurricane. Okay. So, pulling it all together, to conclude all this, we're going to take a detailed look at possibly the most profound vision of the singularity archetype, 2001: A Space Odyssey. And this is the greatest vision of the singularity archetype I know of, and it's the product of the creative collaboration of 2 great geniuses, Arthur C. Clarke, we talked about his childhood zen before, and Stanley Kubrick. The novel and the movie were created concurrently and released in 1968. So, it looks like a moving GIF, I didn't realize that. So, I'm going to give you many plot spoilers. I hope people have seen this masterpiece already. But we start out with a group of sort of missing link hominids, and this black monolith appears in their midst, and they start worshiping it like an idol. The monolith is ominously reminiscent of a giant tombstone. It is both a tombstone and a stargate. And in fact, the phrase Stargate was coined in the book and the movie 2001. And it is an opening that exists at the twin event horizons of death and eschaton. It's not a dead end, but a portal that you travel through to metamorphose. So once this particular group of missing links touches the monolith, they have been evolutionarily enhanced by this artifact of an alien technology that acts like the overlords to act as a catalyst for evolution. So the way we see this is they suddenly discover tool use, and they start picking up these large bones lying around and discovering that they can use them as weapons. And what happens is it gives them an evolutionary advantage over competing tribes of missing link hominids. So after this group has been enhanced, they face off with a warring tribe or group of what had previously been nearly identical, such missing links. But now the alpha of this group comes forward with a bone club in his hand, because he's learned how to use a tool, and now he bludgeons the alpha of the other tribe to death. And in his triumph, he tosses the bone club up, goes spiraling up in the air, and then in a 24th of a second, the frame rate of 2001, 50,000 years of evolutionary development are spliced out, and now we see that bone continuing as a spacecraft in the sky and transition from the distant past to the future. But the world of futuristic high technology that we have shifted to is still a primate world, and a world that is hurtling toward another event horizon, and it's still a world of killer primates. And in fact, that white spacecraft that the bone transitions into was actually meant to be a circling, orbiting nuclear weapons platform. They felt, especially Stanley Kubrick felt, they couldn't make this overt in the film because Stanley Kubrick's previous masterpiece, of course, was Dr. Strangelove. So if there were a nuclear doomsday scenario in 2 films in a row, it would seem over the top, but that was really the intention. Even the name of the astronaut protagonist, Bowman, suggests that we are still primitive killer primates. Okay, so now in this futuristic world of 2001, our technology has developed enough where we can map the magnetic field of the moon, and we discover a powerful magnetic anomaly on the moon, and they excavate that and find a monolith. The magnetic anomaly on the moon apparently was placed there that when we evolved enough that we had enough technological sophistication to go to our close next door neighbor, the moon, and map its magnetic field, we would discover this anomalous object. And here we see a group of white male astronauts, VIPs, who are taking a selfie in front of the monolith to record an historic event. And they are not aware, they're all doing their thumbs up and having an ego-enhancing moment, but they're not aware that what they are actually witnessing is the end of history. And at the first sunrise, the first rays of the sun hitting the recently excavated monolith, a piercing tone emerges from the monolith, and they fall to their knees because it's so piercing. And it's actually a powerful radio signal that the monolith is sending to Iapetus, a moon of Jupiter. And now a series of ego deaths and physical deaths follow. By the way, in the original, their original intention or preference would have been for it to be Saturn, which in a lot of mythological and archetypal ways would have been more appropriate. But the state of the art of special effects at the time, I think they were using Douglas Trumbull's Industrial Light and Magic, they didn't feel they could convincingly pull off the rings of Saturn, so they had to settle for Jupiter. And once they realize that this alien artifact has sent a signal to Iapetus, they start planning a space mission to go to Iapetus to see what's happening there. And here is the spacecraft called Discovery 1, And notice how much it looks like a human sperm cell. That evolutionary theme. But for human beings to travel anywhere in space, they must go through a series of at least ego deaths of various sorts, because our physical form is fragile and not designed for space travel. So we can see here are the sarcophagus-like coffins of most of the astronauts who are in suspended animation, and only Bowman and one other is awake, maintaining the ship. They must eat baby food and undergo toilet training. To go even as pitifully short distance as the middle of their own solar system, they have to be brought to the edge of death and put into suspended animation in a container that looks like a sarcophagus. So again, we have that connection to death. And then something goes wrong in the bonding relationship of two, sometimes synergistic and sometimes antagonistic, at least on the fantasy level, or in people's fears, the evolutionary stream of organic life, of which we are the pinnacle, and artificial intelligence. Okay? And so these two life forms come to recognize each other as caught in a zero-sum game of deadly competition. And Hal, because he has contradictory programming, it creates a sort of neurotic conflict, and he only way of dealing with it is to break the radio link with Earth. And that is another kind of death, because now the astronauts have lost their connection to the mother world. And now the spacecraft is in an isolated crucible traveling through space. And the denouement of a huge evolutionary cycle plays itself out in this lonely crucible, and in the course of the struggle it becomes a 0-1 evolutionary struggle where only one stream of evolution can survive, and all of the humans die except Bowman, and then Hal must die for Bowman to continue the journey. And we're going to take a slight break there. So, in 2001, we see this ever more tense relationship between artificial intelligence, at least it's tense in the sense of human psychology, and that people like Elon Musk and others have some paranoid ideas about what can happen with it. Okay. Bowman travels toward what looks from space like a giant eye on the Jupiterian moon Iapetus. In a small pod, Bowman attempts to land on the pupil of this giant eye in space, and closer observation reveals it to be a giant black monolith. So he's basically entering the pupil of an eye. Again, the eye is a symbol of the Singularity archetype. When he does land, he discovers that this is not an object in the conventional sense, but a singularity. And there is no roof to this object, but is more something like an M.C. Escher inside-out optical illusion. He finds that he is hurtling through what is both an interdimensional corridor and an evolutionary event horizon. It is both the threshold of death and a birth canal. And that is images from the light tunnel he enters. Now, really important to keep in mind is that both the book and the movie 2001 were released in 1968. The field of near-death studies begins 7 years later in 1975 with the publication of Dr. Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, which coins many of the terms we are now familiar with, such as near-death experience and life review. The light canal Bowman passes through is also the tunnel, so often described in the NDE, where the experiencer will often say they feel like they are traveling at the speed of light. For example, a near-death experiencer reports, "The blackness began to erupt into a myriad of stars, and I felt as if I were at the center of the universe with a complete panoramic view in all directions. The next instant, I began to feel a forward surge of movement. The stars seemed to fly past me so rapidly that they formed a tunnel around me." And now, here is the description from the novel 2001. "The star field was expanding as if it was rushing toward him at an inconceivable speed. The expansion was non-linear. The stars at the center hardly seemed to move, while those toward the edge accelerated more and more swiftly until they became streaks of light just before they vanished from view. Here's one man's description of his life review. It's like a picture runs in front of your eyes, like from the time you can remember up to the time you know what was happening, that is the present moment. It seems like pictures of your life just flow in front of your eyes, things you used to do when you were small and stuff, stupid things. It was like a picture, it was like a movie camera running across your eyes in a matter of a second or two, just boom, boom, he snaps his fingers. It was clear as day, clear as day. It was very fast and you could see everything. And here's a similar description from a woman. It was amazing. I could see in the back of my head an array, just an innumerable array of thoughts, memories, things I had dreamt, just in general, thoughts and recollections of the past just raced in front of me in less than 30 seconds. All these things about my mother and grandmother and my brothers and these dreams I've had, I felt like this frame, millions of frames just flashed through. It was thoughts and images of people, and a lot of thoughts just raced. She snaps her finger several times in split seconds. I had my eyes closed underwater, but I could still see those images. She had drowned at that moment. Okay, now here's the description of what happens to Bowman from the novel 2001 as he crosses the event horizon. The springs of memory were being trapped. In controlled recollections, he was reliving the past. And not only vision, but all the sense impressions and all the emotions he had felt at the time were racing past more and more swiftly. His life was unreeling like a tape recorder playing back at ever-increasing speed. And even as he relived these events, he knew that all was indeed well. He was retrogressing down the corridors of time, being drained of knowledge and experience as he swept back toward his childhood. But nothing was being lost. All that he had ever been at every moment of his life was being transferred to safer keeping. Even as one David Bowman ceased to exist, another became immortal. And once again, this was 7 years before the term life review was coined. As Bowman travels through the interdimensional corridor, there is a subject-object shift as our point of view merges with that of Bowman, and together we witness cosmic vistas that seem both biological and astronomical. Like an NDE, we see what seem like new colors and uncanny penetrating lights. And then we enter with Bowman a virtual reality apartment with this Louis Vuitton's French furniture and so forth. And there are multiple autoscopic experiences where Bowman sees from a perspective like outside of a body. He sees different versions of himself. And first we see him as the astronaut that he was before he crossed the event horizon. But then that astronaut hears the sound of an older man dining at a table. It looks like him, but at the age of 70 or so. And then our point of view shifts to the 70-year-old man. And this man then hears a noise coming from another room. And as in an NDE, there are multiple autoscopic experiences. As Bowman sees his body from a disembodied perspective, he goes through the human's life cycle in a series of subject-object reversals. He sees himself as an older man eating at a table, then he becomes the older man. Then the older man hears a noise coming from another room, and then goes in there and sees a profoundly ancient person on their deathbed. It looks like he's 110 years old. And then we shift point of view to this figure, this profoundly old man, and here he is in his deathbed in this virtual reality apartment, and a monolith appears in front of him. And it appears in front of him as both tombstone and evolutionary portal. As a dying man, he reaches toward the monolith in the identical manner of Adam reaching toward God in Michelangelo's God creating Adam on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So on the other side of the event horizon, he is now reborn as a star child, a luminous infant with extremely large eyes. Out of the birth canal, he is reborn as a star child. The star child has large luminous eyes and exists within a luminous sphere, similar to the spherical vision of some near-death experiencers who discover themselves to be luminous spheres of awareness that can see and travel in any direction it will. The birth of the star child is the reemergence of the glorified body after his body has aged and died, a body of awareness freed from the tyranny of matter. This evolutionary step comes thanks to entities, the creators of the monolith, extraterrestrial, advanced extraterrestrials we presume, because it's science fiction, and these are the singularity makers, or the products of an evolutionary process that allow them to emerge into glorified bodies. And this is a quote from the novel. And now, out among the stars, evolution was driving toward new goals. The first explorers of Earth had long since come to the limits of flesh and blood. As soon as their machines were better than their bodies, it was time to move. First their brains, and then their thoughts alone, they transferred into shining new homes of metal and of plastic. So both Clarke and Kubrick were famous atheists. So of course they're imagining the Ray Kurzweil technological rapture of organic beings transferring their consciousness into AI, inorganic AI. In these, they roamed among the stars, no longer built spaceships, they were spaceships. But the age of the machine entities swiftly passed. In their ceaseless experimenting, they had learned to store knowledge in the structure of space itself and to preserve their thoughts for eternity in frozen lattices of light. So the etherealization and liberation from the tyranny of matter continues, even in the technological context. They could become creatures of radiation, free at last from the tyranny of matter. And here is Bowman's experience of emergence into a glorified body. He still needed for a little while this shell of matter as the focus of his powers. His indestructible body was his mind's present image of itself, and for all his powers, he knew that it was still a baby. So he would remain until he decided on a new form, or a path beyond the necessities of matter. And it was decided upon a new form. So in other words, now he is in a shape-shifting idioplastic body, which is the real ultimate fulfillment of the will toward the glorified body, is not to have a better body, but to be in an idioplastic form where you can change shapes or be disembodied as you prefer. And here is part of the description of crossing the event horizon. Here time had not begun, not until the suns that now burned were long since dead would light and reshape this void. Unwittingly he had crossed it once, now he must cross it again, this time of his own volition. The thought filled him with a sudden freezing terror, so that for a moment he was wholly disoriented, and his new vision of the universe trembled and threatened to shatter into 1,000 fragments. So once again we have the ego view that sees death as the emergency, while another part, a deeper part of the psyche, sees it as an emergence. It was not fear of the galactic gulfs that chilled his soul, but a more profound disquiet stemming from the unborn future, for he had left behind the time scales of his human origin. We talked about the transcendence of linear time. Now, as he contemplated that band of starless night, he knew his first intimations of the eternity that yawned before him. He would no longer be in a linear time-based environment. Then he remembered that he would never be alone, and his panic slowly ebbed. The crystal clear perception of the universe was restored to him, not he knew wholly by his own efforts. When he needed guidance in his faltering steps, it would be there. He will be telepathically in touch with the overmind, or the intelligence of the universe, basically. Confident once more, like a high diver who had regained his nerve, he launched himself across the light years. The galaxy burst forth from the mental frame in which he had enclosed it. Stars and nebulae poured past him in an illusion of infinite speed. Phantom suns exploded and fell behind as he slipped like a shadow through the cores. The cold, dark waste of cosmic dust which he once feared seemed no more than the beat of a raven's wing across the face of the sun. The stars were thinning out. The glare of the Milky Way was dimming into a pale ghost of the glory he had known, and when he was ready would know again. He was back precisely where he wished to be, in the space that men called real. So we will conclude there with Bowman crossing the event horizon. You can find more about the Singularity archetype, much more in my book, Crossing the Event Horizon, Human Metamorphosis in the Singularity Archetype. It's available on Amazon and iBook and all the usual places. A digital version and plus an audio version is available in a combo deal on my website. This is my website, zaporacle.com. You can also find the 664 card free online oracle, the Zap Oracle, and many other writings about the Singularity archetype. If you go to the category menu, and it's a drop-down menu, you'll see like future evolution as one of the categories. Click that and you'll find more articles on the Singularity archetype. And you can also find 140 at the present date articles I've published on the online magazine Reality Sandwich. This is Jonathan Zapp of zaporacle.com. Thank you so much for watching this video, and best wishes for your journey across the event horizon.